Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust, logo here, is about keeping land and housing affordable for future generations. That's one of its key purposes. Another purpose is about putting developments around land and housing back in the hands of local people. It's very much a grassroots initiative about trying to work from where people start at, not coming at it from a developer's perspective or from an institutional perspective. And it's one of 225, Brighton Community Land Trust is one of over 200 community land trusts in the country. And they have those as their goals, all owned by local members. So if you do nothing else today, as a result of what I'm saying, please become a member of Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust. It's only a £1 membership, and we've got a really fast-growing membership, and it will get some legs with this new programme of funding as well. So I encourage you to do that. Why community-led housing? Johnny talked about the housing crisis in Brighton, and it's not a surprise to anyone, but I think it's really interesting to also think about how it manifests itself locally in Brighton. So in Brighton, between the years 2011 and 2016, the price of a 2-bedroom property in the city grew by 43%. And over that same 5-year period of time, the average take-home wage, and that's for people who are full-time employed, who often have the best wages, increased by 7% over the same time period. So the crisis in Brighton is, very acute and quite stark. And also it has a particular form in Brighton, which is we have a much higher private rented sector population of people living in the private rented sector. So in the country as a whole, it's around 15%. But in Brighton and Hove, it's 28%. So that's fast. That was in 2011. So we don't know what it'll be when the next census happens in 2021. But my guess is it'll be a lot higher. And so we're looking at a third of the population of Brighton and Hove living in the private rented sector, with all the issues that go with it, affordability, quality of housing, and the complete lack of control that people have. So most people in the private rented sector are on 2 months' notice. So one of the key things that we're interested in is addressing that question of how can you have stable and secure housing when you're on 2 months' notice? How can you bring up families in those conditions? So we're particularly interested in that portion of the population as well. So what is community-led housing? Community-led housing really is about engaging local people to find their own solutions. It's about supporting them to find their own solutions as well. So some of the examples are out there in the city are like housing co-ops. Many of you will have heard of them, some of you will live in them. Co-housing, which is the project that Johnny just described, that's a co-housing project. People trying to live more collectively and in a more neighbourly environment. Self-build, which Johnny also talked about, but that's a particular interest. Small self-build projects. The straw bale talk was very interesting for that. And it's also about creative house shares. It's not all about new building, and that's really important as well for us. But basically, it's about local people working together to build or convert or to just buy properties that suit them for their purposes, for their housing purposes. And it is also about fighting to keep housing affordable in perpetuity. So some of the things it's not institution-led, it's not social housing like council housing is, and really we're not interested, we're trying to support projects that are not about making a profit from housing, so whether that's individually or as an organisation. So that's the definition. Why do we need to grow it? Well, it'll be no surprise in that kind of housing market that the UK doesn't provide very fertile soil for community-led housing. We have a tradition of a very strong ideology of home ownership that stems further back than even the 80s, but really accelerated in the 80s. So the peak of home ownership in Britain in 2001, 75% of the population homeowners. It's declining now because of the unaffordability of housing. But we have a really strong ideology around home ownership that other European countries don't have, and other countries outside Europe as well. So it doesn't offer fertile soil. However, there have always been community-led housing projects in the country. I don't know if many of you know this website, Diggers and Dreamers. This is a website that's been going since the 70s, and it lists communities, intentional communities. People have come together and made really creative housing solutions, housing and land solutions, urban, rural, suburban, all sorts. And they do a really useful job of networking between those groups to invite new members. You'll see on the right here that they offer places for volunteers to come and visit. And it's a really well-developed kind of network. But these groups, they exist in the cracks of the system. The system ploughs on, doing what it does, and these groups kind of navigate their way and find little cracks in the system and work their way through that. And what about in Brighton? We have a track record in community-led housing, it's true. We have what I call like the peers and hedgehogs syndrome, which is we have 2 peers, which is a really good housing co-op. It houses 68 people on 5 different sites. It started in the 80s and got grant funding to build some of its buildings. We have Out of Town is a housing co-op that houses 19 people in 2 different properties. We have really successful self-build projects as well. We had Seesaw in the early 90s, which is a council-owned site on Wilson Avenue. We've got Diggers at Gulf Drive. There's 2 projects actually on Gulf Drive. And the famous one that probably most of you have seen, which is Hedgehog up in Bevendine, which was on Grand Designs programme. So we have this we've had these innovations and we've had these moments where creative moments have happened where communities have come together and decided to find their own solution. But it's difficult, like Johnny says, to kind of make any impact if we're working at this scale, where projects are only happening once every now and then, and they're not happening at any critical mass, and we're not generating a broader movement. So at the moment, we do have are kind of seeds and fledgling organisations, and some of you in the audience here will be part of these. I noticed Julian's here. Julian's one of our directors of the Community Land Trust, but he's also a leading person in Sussex Co-housing. Polly, I think, is here. Polly doesn't mind me mentioning. He's part of Selby Housing Co-op. So we have Bunker Housing Co-op that is very well known in the city because it's our pilot project for low-income families to self-build their own housing on council land. And they should be going on site in spring, so they're a key project. So we do have this kind of diversity, and we need to work kind of collectively to kind of keep the cracks in the system open and to kind of help groups to get through those cracks and develop the space to do that. And size kind of matters in this too. The reason why size matters is because it's really important for people to be in reasonable sized groups to get things done. There's that nice, we have a number of self-builders that come to us and they've come to it kind of as an individual concept. And what we're trying to do as a programme is try and encourage them to work with other people, to come together as groups. Because as well-organised, supportive and creative groups, stuff can really happen, like in the Diggers and Dreamers tradition. But it's very hard to do it individually or in small groups. For example, mortgage lenders won't really consider you a group until you have at least 7 or 8, different mortgage lenders have different boundaries, independent people who don't live together or aren't related. So that's the size of group people need to be in at the point of applying for a mortgage. Now, you don't have to start as a group being that big, but you have to be at that point, you have to be established as a group functioning that way at the point of applying for a mortgage. So it's important to know that when you set up your group. It's important to know what the obstacles are going to be, the hoops you're going to have to jump through, and that's what we're trying to help people do, is come together that way. We also need to connect to what's already working and has been for many years, the traditions that are out there that have been successful in things like community-led housing, which is the cooperative tradition. It's really important. We have the national cooperative movements, we also have Cooperative Development Society, CDS, but we also have a local organisation called CHIBA that is trying to galvanise work around housing co-ops. So the other thing is we need to catch the waves as they happen. And one of the really big waves in Britain at the moment in community-led housing is co-housing. The UK Co-housing Network coordinates the groups all forming at the moment. And like you saw, Johnny's project is on site at the moment. So it's really good to have those inspiring sites that are actually being built. Some of you may have picked up on the older women's co-housing in London. A lot of publicity around that group in Barnet, London. Ouch. They've had a lot of publicity. That's co-housing. So co-housing has a lot of momentum behind it, and it's really important that what we do is find those waves of momentum and we kind of go with them and support them. So that's what we're trying to do. I think it's really important to come back to, it's not all about increasing new builds. It is about increasing the way people, changing the way people think about how they're going to live. So about increasing sharing. And this is on another number of levels, actually. One of our jobs is to kind of stretch people's imagination about that concept of how you want to live. So when our group started, we all imagined that we would want to have an apartment each in a block and share a garden, and that was really more or less what we thought we would be up for. And once I've been around and visited some of those communities in Diggers and Dreamers, I realised that it was so much more possible to do something much more creative than that. And where we've ended up is having a house share in which we're sharing, we'll be sharing bathrooms, we'll be sharing kitchens, we'll be sharing all manner of stuff, reception rooms, all sorts of stuff. And that makes it much more affordable for us, but it also makes it much more interesting for us, actually, the more we've talked about it. So I think it's not for everyone, but it's important to not close the door on the different ideas that other communities have actually practiced to make living together interesting as well as more affordable. And one of the things I thought about before I came to this talk is about the statistics on how much space we all need to live individually. I don't know, does anybody in the audience know how much space, if you divided up everyone, the whole population of England and all the dwellings in England, how much space we'd all be entitled to if it was all shared out equally? Does anybody have an idea? No? It basically works out at about 40 metres squared, or what's the footage in that? It's 430 square feet. All the usable space in all the dwellings in England, divided up by the population of England, including children. So that's about the size of a large double garage. So it's partly to kind of ask these questions and think, well, if you're living in a house in which per person you've got more than the size of a large double garage per person, you're on the privileged side of the kind of housing divide. And if you're on the other side, obviously, it's a different equation. And I think why I'm bringing that up is because we need to start looking at space as a resource. In a city like Brighton, it's a really, really expensive and sought-after resource. And there are lots of ways that people can use that space more efficiently. They can still have private space, but maybe sharing heating systems, sharing drainage systems. Not everything has to be privatised to individual units. So that's one of the things we're trying to do is be creative about how we do those things as well. And yes, where there's new build, it's true, we need to be looking at density. So I'm putting up this picture of Lilac in Leeds, low impact living, affordable community, which is a great example. I mean, and it taps into both the talks because it is a co-housing project just like Johnny described. It's a straw bale construction, like was described in the first talk. And what's brilliant about it is it also achieves the density that you need. In Brighton, you particularly need density because the planners won't let you develop areas if you don't achieve certain target densities. So there are really good examples out there that can demonstrate how it can be done. But it's not all about new build. That's the important message, really. So how are we doing this? This is our team. Like I say, basically, the Community Land Trust wrote a business case to the council when there was some national money offered as part of the Second Homes Initiative. DCLG, Department of Communities and Local Government, offered some money around to cities in areas in Britain that had a problem with second home ownership, where second home ownership was forcing up prices. And Brighton got just under £500,000. So the CLT, a team of us, put together a business case to the council and said, we can spend this money creatively, innovatively and really effectively to capacity build in community-led housing. And they accepted our business case, and we had a grant agreement that started in November. And we've basically got a programme of 10 months of activity. Half of the money is spent on this enabling team to go out there and work with groups to support them. Amy and Ed work in awareness raising and comms. So we had our launch last week. So that was it last week or was it 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, maybe. And they work on putting stuff up on social media and tapping into that. Kirk is working in community engagement, which is sometimes where communities find it harder to come together. They don't have that tradition of maybe working together like maybe many people here might understand. And so she's trying to do that outreach to communities that find it harder to organise around particular sites and developments. We have Nicola Thomas, who's an architect by background, who's finding properties and land that are appropriate for community-led housing. And we have Kim and Maria, who are organising our grant giving programme. So we split half the money between working as enablers to support groups and giving money directly to groups to develop projects that can show how community-led housing works for local people. So we give grants up to £50,000. Many of the grants are much smaller than that because groups are at different stages. So at different stages, they need smaller amounts of money just to get to the next level. And that's what the grant giving is all about. It's about moving groups to the next level. And we try and work with groups, really closely with groups, to help them strengthen their applications to us. We don't ask people to write application forms. We ask them to write documents that they would need to write irrespective of this grant programme, that they would need to write about their project, saying what they want to do and who they want to do it with. These documents they write need to stand on their own and be good for the group beyond the life of this programme, not just for a grant application. And we have an action learning programme, which I'm leading on, which is all about bringing people together to collectively learn and learn efficiently. So our first one has kicked off already. It's all about financial planning. We had an introductory session, and then we had some mortgage lending surgeries with 4 ethical lenders. And we've got loads more. We've got a self-build one on the 17th of March starting. So all of this, you can find out more through emailing admin@bhclt.org.uk.